We are joined tonight by Dr. Vladimir Hlasny, who is an economic affairs officer with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia in Beirut, Lebanon. Prior to joining ESCWA, he served for 13 years as an associate professor of economics at Ewha Women's University in Seoul. He conducts research in labor and welfare economics, particularly in relation to Asia and the Middle East. In history, he has undertaken several studies on the subject of Czechoslovak-Korean relations during the Cold War. His research has been published in general interest journals, including the World Bank Economic Review, Journal of Economic Surveys, Social Science Quarterly, and the Korea Journal. He holds a doctorate in economics from Michigan State University and is an avid gardener and beekeeper. Tonight, Dr. Hlasny will be discussing Jaroslav Bařinka. Perhaps we might call him the father of the Czech-based Korean studies. He was among the longest-serving Czech diplomats in both Koreas. He died at the age of 89 in October of 2020, so just about 1 year ago. Bařinka served as an interpreter and second secretary at the Czechoslovak embassy in Pyongyang starting in '55 and as late as 1976. He was the first civilian Czech to visit the Republic of Korea in 1970, returning here again during the '88 Olympics, and in '91 became Czechoslovakia's and in '93 Czechia's first chargé d'affaires to Seoul. After the lecture, as always, there will be time for questions. Would you please welcome Dr. Hlasny? Vladimir, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you so much. So I will be sharing my slides, if that's all right.
Yeah, I should have you set to do that.
Okay. Here we go. I think it's this one. Share. Can you see the first slide well?
Yeah, yes.
Yes. Vladimir, okay. Go to the menu option that says slideshow. There you go. Yep. Thank you. We've got that. We can see it bigger. We appreciate that. Okay. I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Stephen. There's some echo in my room. I hope you don't hear much of that on your side. So I'm in a kind of a dungeon here, but I hope that the sound quality will be good enough for me, good enough for you.
We can hear you well. So yes, as you say, a little bit of echo, but it's okay. Go right ahead.
Great. I'm not a historian, and so I always feel a little bit awkward discussing history. I'm worried about the questions that the audience might ask, but we'll live through it together. I just want to kind of share a story of conversations that I've had with Jaroslav Bařinka. He was this 88, 89-year-old gentleman that I met with regularly in a Czech pub in Prague. I was having beers, he was having coffee, and we were just chatting. At first, I asked him for these conversations to learn about how the Korean studies started in Prague. There's a long history since the early 50s, as a matter of fact, 40s, of teaching Korean in Czechoslovakia. And because I wasn't part of that group, I wanted to learn more how it started, who were the founding fathers. And I have to say here that I have to correct Stephen that no, Jaroslav Bařinka, I can't considering the founding father, but one of the small first founding cohorts of Koreanologists or Korean studies scholars, enthusiasts in Czechoslovakia. And to this day, he's the person that Czech scholars of Korean studies refer to and whom they admire. So in that community, he is an influential figure. And anyway, as I had these numerous conversations over beer and coffee with Jaroslav Bařinka, it turned out that there were many stories that were really interesting on several different levels. One level was just his own life experiences. He was born in 1931, which was that was the interwar period. He came from a mining family, and he told me some of the history of his family going back 5 centuries. And that interwar era, and then the Second World War and the start of communism in Czechoslovakia, and the different relations among countries in the Soviet bloc. That's another story that you could hear from his storytelling. So actually, on the private level, or his personal life story is interlinked with these political developments between Soviet Union, China, North Korea, the relationships with the US, and so on. And I think I'll talk about that during the presentation. So I think on the one hand, it's an interesting story just from the perspective of one person having a life from the 1930s all the way to 2020s. That in Prague, many things have changed, and there were ups and downs, and it was a full cycle of developments, you could say. And then on the completely different level, at the global level, you can track how the relationships among countries affected Jaroslav Bařinka as a person, and how and from his stories I learned how the study of Korean culture was changing decade by decade depending on the political mood. And I guess, and lastly, I would say that just the encounters of Koreans and Czechs over these many decades is another component here that I found fascinating. And I will get to that in a few minutes as well. So just here on the front page, I want to say that a shorter version of this presentation is an article that will be published in December in the Seoul Journal of Korean Studies. But there I had to limit the discussion of Korean-Czech encounters, and I don't say anything about Jaroslav Bařinka's family history and personal sentiments and stories. And so it's a partial story, and I am considering taking other parts of these stories and having the transactions consider that for publication. So in the most significant reason to be interested in Jaroslav Bařinka's life, we could say that so he lived to the age of 89 through many political developments in Czechoslovakia and Korea and worldwide. He was among the founding figures, we can safely say, of Korean studies or Koreanology in Czechoslovakia, longest serving Czech diplomat operating in both Koreas. Like Stephen already said, he was the first civilian. There are some here we could argue in which way is the safest way to phrase it. There was at Panmunjom, there was a neutral nations supervisory commission, and some of the soldiers stationed there had a right to visit Seoul. But in But in terms of touring and civilian visits, I think we can safely claim that Bařinka had this unique opportunity to visit the Republic of Korea in the year 1970. He participated in major events at the 1970 Osaka World Expo, 1988 Seoul Olympics, 2002 FIFA World Cup, and has some inside stories to tell about individuals and happenings at those events. He was this we can say completely safely that he was in the vacuum that existed in Czechoslovakia in 1989, when there were political purges, communist related figures were fired, and he was the one with the cleanest career record. And as a Korean studies specialist, he was recommended for the post of the first chargé d'affaires, and he held that post from 91 to 92. And then when Czechoslovakia split, he continued for the next 2 years as the, again, first chargé d'affaires of the Czech Republic. He made scholarly contributions about Confucian architecture, writings about the political economy in Korea, in both Koreas, and I think generally East Asia. So even in terms of academic contributions, he has a major role, and one of the most cited Czech scholars in this Czech community of, or European community of Korean scholars. And just on a personal level, he was a very interesting person to talk to. He had a very clear mind to the end. Without any preparation, he was able to speak about Confucian Solons, the Confucian academies in the Middle Ages, or about metallurgy, coming from the mining family. And so he was he was a resource of knowledge on multiple fronts. And he was a lifelong RAS Korea member. And so in this, it's my pleasure to present his life to this group. Okay, just I will speed up a little bit here. He was born in eastern part of the Czech Republic in Moravia, in a city called Ostrava, which is a mining country. And so here on the right, we see a picture of himself and his father. His father was a lead engineer in a local mine. In this countryside, you can see there are many mountains, a lot of greenery, a lot of trees. At the bottom, I show one postcard that he wrote to his mother about his coming arrival to the village. The stamp is Adolf Hitler. It's from I think, probably 1939. And so, and I think in the following slides, I think we'll see some of these references that he wasn't a person who was coming from the capital city. He came from the rural area where he grew up surrounded with mining, with nature. And that influenced his interests and his maybe position with respect to society throughout his life. His father, because he was a significant figure in the mining industry, faced some persecution from Gestapo. So during the Second World War, the family had to hide. They could not, his father couldn't work in the mines, and the family had to go to the countryside to live in grandfather's house in a small village in these mountains. I think the one significance here is that dealing with this persecution from the Gestapo, And at the bottom of this slide, I show a small quote how Jaroslav Bařinka's first encounter with the Soviets was that a Soviet soldier started shooting at his family, saying that all Czechs need to be shot. I think that that prepared him to be very suspicious of autocratic regimes and not to join political organizations. So Bařinka never joined the Communist Party, even though that meant that throughout his career he could earn only, I think, 20 or 15% less than his colleagues, simply by not signing the membership form for the Communist Party. But he never signed it, and he suffered throughout the communist regime until 1989, and then he had the benefit that as one of the clean people, he was able to serve in the new administration in democracy. But I'll get to that later. So his childhood was very happy. He lived in the countryside with his grandparents and 8 cousins. One of the cousins was Olga Palkovska. And this is just kind of a curious fact that Olga Palkovska ended up marrying an Austrian Czech artist, Oskar Kokoschka, who was, Hitler called him the degenerate artist. So Kokoschka stayed in this grandfather's house with Jaroslav Bařinka and the family for several years, and he painted some of his works in this house. So in the background of these paintings, you see a lot of greenery. Well, those are the trees behind the grandfather's house. So in this most famous painting by Oskar Kokoschka, called The Self-Portrait of a Degenerate Artist, he painted himself, he started painting himself, and then he learned that Adolf Hitler had referred to him as a degenerate, and he made the painting even more reactionary than he intended it to. He crossed his fingers, he crossed his arms in the painting, which shows that he's opposed. He painted some deer in the background, a running person. I think the interpretation these days is that he felt that he was escaping away from regime. He felt chased by regime, and that's what he's painting in these pictures. Anyway, that's just on the. This slide just shows that Jaroslav Bařinka had a very friendly, very nice childhood, and he was surrounded with his family, and he was surrounded with people who were not necessarily in line with the main regime in the country. Okay, in 1945, his mother introduced him to geography and East Asia and Korean affairs. They started subscribing to a bi-monthly magazine, New Orient, which is being published to this day. He started reading some novels, Kang Yong-hil's Thatched Roof. He read a magazine version of what would become a full book, Korea Yesterday and Today by Han Hung-soo, which is who is a Korean archaeologist, and inspired by these readings, Bařinka decided to study East Asian studies and Korean. He wanted specifically to study under this Korean professor Han Hung-soo in Prague. So that's how he started in 1947. So here I should pause to say that this was right at the end of World War II. The normal institutions started coming into existence. So the Oriental Institute in Prague was founded in 1945. And so Bařinka was one of the first students to enroll and to specialize in Korean studies. he took lessons from Professor Han Hong-soo himself, who studied in Austria and Germany and was in Prague temporarily on the way back to North Korea. So just a few months after Bařinka enrolled in the Korean program, Han Hong-soo left in the spring of 1948. And during that time, there were several other Korean personalities who traveled through Czechoslovakia to return to North Korea. And these people gave lessons at the Oriental Institute, and Jaroslav Bařinka was able to study under them. I also want to pause here a little bit, that on this slide, I show a number of different people, and they all have slightly different relationship to North Korea, Czechoslovakia, and let's say the West. Han Hong-soo simply studied temporarily in Austria and Germany, and he always intended to go back to North Korea, and eventually he succeeded and started serving in the North Korean regime, I believe before he perished in North Korea. Alice Hyun was a Korean American woman who operated for a long time in Hawaii and California. He was a communist, and at the end of the war, her desire was to return to North Korea to serve the country, and the only way that she thought was possible was to go through Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia in these few years had a very special role as the only kind of window between the West and the kind of the Soviet bloc or North Korea. So Alice Hyun traveled from California to Czechoslovakia, and as soon as it was possible, as soon as she got a travel authorization, she went to North Korea. So in 1949, she was in Prague, but in the following year, she continued her journey to North Korea. Once in Pyongyang, she worked in the administration for several years before she perished. Okay. At the bottom, we see Sanu Hakwon, Harold Sanu, who was also a Korean-American communist operating between California and Washington State. And his intention was to do the same thing, go to North Korea and establish himself there. But once he was in Czechoslovakia, now we're not sure what exactly happened. I think he was not given the travel authorization, and that's why he had to give up. He could not travel to Pyongyang because he didn't get a visa. He himself, when he returned to the US, he claimed that he saw the reality of communism, and he gave up his project and returned to the US as a giving up on the idea of communism. Regardless, he's slightly different from Han Hong-soo and Alice Hyun, because he eventually returned to the West and stayed there. I think I will. And one thing I can also say that this was also a very special period between World War II and the Korean War, when a number of exchanges took place and delegations from North Korea came. So on the right, I show a picture from the World Peace Congress, where we see Alice Hyun in the background and her son Wellington Chung. And in the forefront of the picture, we see delegates, high-level delegates from North Korea coming to Prague, presenting their case for the establishment of the communist Korean state. Okay, on that, I will move forward. And one interesting episode that happened in these years, when Jaroslav Bařinka learned that Han Hong-soo was leaving, he ran across Prague. He thought Han Hong-soo was leaving on the same day or the next morning. So he ran across Prague, and this was February 1948. Major protests were happening throughout the city and throughout the country. It turned out eventually that this would be the communist coup d'etat, and Jaroslav Bařinka suddenly saw the non-communist students resisting the kind of onslaught of communist soldiers, and he himself, he says that it was this episode that he suddenly for good decided that the communist cause is not his own cause, and he would he felt that he didn't subscribe to the communist view of society, and decided not to join the new regime in the coming years. Okay. Jaroslav Bařinka continued his studies. So from the year 1947, he studied Korean language and Korean culture, Korean political economy. And by the year 1952, 1953, he became an official upperclassman, and he became in charge of duties such as teaching Korean language to his junior classmates, teaching Czech to Korean diplomats at the Korean embassy, and providing interpretation and translation to delegations, and on the arrival of groups of orphans from North Korea. So this is, we can say that in these years, Jaroslav Bařinka's career officially started. He became immersed in all these activities, and he started observing the political developments between Czechoslovakia and North Korea in detail. I think significant development that happened. So as I said, delegations were arriving in Czechoslovakia from Korea, and some groups were there to stay. So I mentioned the groups of North Korean orphans who were brought in and were living in orphanages, and then were distributed to families. And another significant group of arrivals was the students, even university students. So in December 1951, the first cohort of North Korean students came. It was a group of 20 military officers and senior students who came to Czechoslovakia to get quality instruction, especially in technical sciences. So in the first semester or year of their study, they studied political economy, Marxism, Leninism, Czech language, Russian, but then they moved to study technical sciences, engineering, metallurgy, chemical studies, in order to bring the technical know-how back to North Korea and help with the development of the country. This was only 20 students. By the next year, 40 more students came. And as a matter of fact, for the next 20-30 years, new cohorts of students kept coming in. And and some of these students would eventually serve in the ministries or as lead engineers in North Korean mines and factories. And as a matter of fact, several future prime ministers of North Korea studied in Czechoslovakia. They would start in the economic program. It has been dubbed the Prague School of Economics in North Korea. So this is something that I think is not currently explored very well, and that will be my next project to map. For now, I only have information about the first few cohorts of students, but I haven't been able to map which of these persons have become very influential in the North Korean regime. So this was a picture when the first cohort of students was leaving North Korea for Czechoslovakia. This is their visit to a castle in Czechoslovakia, Castle Karlstein. The picture is not very clear, but it's the same group of individuals. Jaroslav Bařinka interacted with these students very closely, one-on-one, day-to-day. During the morning, he assisted them with school. In the afternoon, they had one-on-one lectures or conversations to polish their skills in Czech and to do the exchange of learning. So these particular individuals became staff members of Ministry of Trade or in the North Korean industry, but they were not influential in the North Korean regime per se. Okay, and here I just mentioned that, well, some of these friendships were lifelong, but lifelong means something special in relation to Korea, because some of these people, when they went back to North Korea, they disappeared, or they were purged to labor camps or to the countryside, and that's how the relationship between Bařinka and some of these students ended, that they could not continue interacting. Okay, in 1957, Kim Il-sung ordered all students and staff, North Korean staff in Czechoslovakia, to return to Pyongyang. It was after the August 1956 attempt at a coup. Interestingly, it was during Kim Il-sung's journey through Soviet Union to Czechoslovakia. Kim Il-sung visited Prague, I believe, in July 1956. And as he was returning to North Korea, there was an attempt at a coup, but it was not successful, and huge purges in Pyongyang resulted. I think we'll see references to these purges on the next few slides. So that was the end of physical interactions between Jaroslav Bařinka and these students. Most of them he would never see in his life again. They returned to North Korea. They would not be able to go back to Europe, and some of them perished, and they could not communicate with Bařinka. But with one or two, he was able to reunite in Pyongyang and continued interacting. In the meanwhile, in 1955, Bařinka graduated with a degree from the Korean program, and even though he had got in some political trouble at the university, there was a wave of liberalization after the deaths of the Czechoslovak president Gottwald and the Soviet president Stalin in 1953, and Bařinka was able to ride out the trouble and graduate successfully in 1955. And even though the university refused to provide him with the recommendations, he still managed to be recruited by the Ministry of Foreign Trade. and traveled to Pyongyang in, I believe, August 1955. So his professional career in Korean studies, we can say, started in summer 1955 when he traveled to Pyongyang. In the first few years, the situation in Pyongyang was very relaxed. He was able to travel by train without any authorizations to visit historic sites all around the country. So he traveled to both coasts. He could hike freely around Pyongyang and surrounding areas. With his colleagues, they bought a boat and they navigated the Dedong River and swam in public pools. So the situation was very relaxed until 1957 or 58, when the purges started and many restrictions were established. So I don't have too many photographs from Bařinka's work in Korea. Just a very few photographs that I have, I tried to put here. So Bařinka was very close to some of the staff at the embassy, with whom they led a very anti-regime, many anti-regime conversations. Bařinka reported that when he met local people, it was always very clear, very easy to recognize who was pro-regime, who was anti-regime, and it was very easy to talk freely to the anti-regime people. As I said, by the fall of 1957, mobility and communication restrictions were put in place. Traveling by train became difficult. The restrictions were haphazard, where one day Bařinka could only travel by car, one day he was instructed to only travel by train or not to travel from Pyongyang at all. Because either Bařinka, as a foreigner visitor, he was prohibited from seeing certain sites, or he was encouraged. The regime wanted him to see some military facilities, to report on them, and to report on North Korea's military might. Okay. Since 1957, Jaroslav Bařinka himself witnessed many scenes of repression and persecution. So there was a double propaganda terror regime where locals and also foreign visitors, on the one hand, they were shown heavy propaganda of how wonderfully the Korean economy and military were doing. On the other hand, they were threatened with what could happen if the locals or if the foreigners misbehave and don't follow the propaganda line as expected. So Jaroslav Bařinka observed some assault on people, where, let's say, a person at a factory was suddenly dragged into the circle, and other people started shouting accusations against this person and started assaulting physically, or even shooting this person without any formal court case. He observed many people being banished to the countryside, where in the middle of the night a big truck would come to a neighborhood in Pyongyang, load up pre-selected people, even from among Bařinka's acquaintances, and these people vanished in the countryside, or could not communicate, could not correspond very frequently with those who were left behind in Pyongyang. Okay. But I think on the light side, Bařinka also reported that just as people were scared of the political regime and the secret police, they lost the fear of other institutions, such as patrolmen on the streets. So if civilians saw a local policeman doing something wrong, let's say hitting a child, the local people would approach the policeman and would punish him. So I think kind of the message here is that the social fabric changed, and the view of local people and institutions changed and maybe polarized. Some people were very scared of some institutions and lost completely fear of other institutions and other social norms. Okay. Bařinka, while in Pyongyang from 1955 to 1959, Bařinka tried to reconnect with his former students and with his instructors. He was able to meet some students, but he could not meet his instructors. Again, it's important to realize that this was a very critical period, the 1957 the coup attempt. And so before 1957, some of these people had positions in the administration, and suddenly in 1957 they were disappeared. So in the initial years, he was told that Alice Young still is very successful at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's their best English language translator. She's fabulous. She's very funny, fantastic translator, an amazing colleague. And all of a sudden, people stopped talking about her and discouraging Bařinka to ask. Bařinka also tried to adopt, I think that's another unique thing from his life, is that he tried to adopt a Korean homeless orphan that he met. As Bařinka walked the streets of Pyongyang, he met this boy whom he gave coins once in a while. He befriended this boy, and over time, he offered him accommodation at the Czechoslovak embassy compound, and he started a formal legal guardianship process for this boy. He was very successful on the North Korean side. Again, this was before 1957, and he got all the approvals from North Korean ministries. Then all of a sudden, this deputy minister of interior was executed. So as the regime changed, Bařinka couldn't continue very well with the process. And I think during these years also some suspicions arose. The North Korean regime started being suspicious of Jaroslav Bařinka, and eventually this legal guardianship broke down, and the North Korean regime took away this boy from Bařinka, and both Bařinka suffered, and the little boy, as we'll see in the next few slides, suffered from this development. So here on this slide, I just report that in the first few months and years, Bařinka was very successful with the adoption process. This little boy who was malnourished and stunted, suddenly his health suffered from lung disease. His health dramatically improved. He learned Czech on a very, very good level, so that when they traveled together to Prague, this boy would enroll in a regular public school and would follow the curriculum normally. And then all of a sudden, the Czechoslovak regime, on some pressure from the North Korean embassy, denied the guardianship to Bařinka. I will speed up a little bit. I think I'm a little bit behind. So the bottom line is that they arrived in Czechoslovakia in 1959, I think in the early 1959, and within 1 year, the authorities, jointly Czechoslovak and North Korean authorities, took away the boy and forced him to return to Pyongyang by February 1960. This was a personal tragedy for both of them, for Jaroslav Bařinka. Bařinka sought assurances that this little boy would be cared for, but it was clear that all of these were empty promises. Starting in May 1960, Jaroslav Bařinka learned that this boy was repeatedly arrested. He was sent to the mines, where again his lung problems deteriorated. In 1961, Jaroslav Bařinka was able to return to North Korea on an academic fellowship for a research study. So temporarily, between 1961 and 1963, when Bařinka was in Korea, he managed to get the boy to come back to Pyongyang and live relatively healthily. But again, once Bařinka left in 1963, the situation for the little boy turned to the worse, and in 1964 he disappeared completely. And I think this was a very significant moment in Bařinka's life, that he expressed so much bitterness, and he uncompromisingly how do you say, not scolded. Scolded is not a strong word. He was completely angry at the North Korean regime, of the mistrust that the regime places in the North Korean regime punishes individual people in order to achieve some large political goals. It cuts the legal and human relations among regular citizens between Bařinka and the adopted boy, and this further kind of ascertained Jaroslav Bařinka that the North Korean regime is ultimately evil. I'm not sure whether it was in connection to the case of adoption, but around the same times, or which way the causality goes, whether the suspicions between the regime and Bařinka led to the failure of adoption or vice versa. But Bařinka himself experienced some persecution and provocations against himself. So in 1961, he returned to North Korea to do historical research and archaeological research. And all of a sudden, the local authorities denied him access to information, refused to allow him to travel. They nearly declared him a persona non grata and nearly banished him to go abroad. On the provocation side, they also offered him some manuscript that he could submit to Charles University as his own doctoral dissertation, but he suspected some wrong intentions, and he refused the offer. Again, around the same time, so I think one lesson here is that these political developments are not very easy to follow, and the developments didn't happen one at a time, but several developments happened simultaneously, and it's hard to attribute some outcomes to one of these political developments. So as I said, in 1957, there was the coup attempt at Kim Il-sung. Simultaneously, there was an ideological split between China and the Soviet Union that led to some separation and halt in exchanges. Officially started in 1956, but it became more pronounced in 1959 to 1963. In the case of Bařinka, he experienced it himself to the extent that we can attribute it that way. So when Bařinka returned from North Korea in 1963 and tried to submit his thesis in lieu of a doctoral dissertation, this was rejected by authorities on some technical, partly on technical grounds, partly on the grounds of the subject, that really the authorities were no longer interested in East Asia and North Korea. The political mood was to study Soviet Union and other countries in the fold of Soviet Union. So opportunities for exchange and for resources to do Korean studies dried out. And Bařinka shifted his focus from Korean to Japanese. Okay. So for the next 5 years to a decade, Bařinka focused more on Japanese studies. He was fluent in Japanese, so he helped the Japanese delegations who started newly arriving, and in 1970 he participated in the World Expo in Osaka. He had an official kind of institutional position in that World Expo. After the World Expo ended, he had some time for travel, so he spent some of the time visiting the Korean studies at Tenri University in Nara Prefecture, Japan, and which was known for having a large Korean library. And at the World Expo Pavilion, he befriended a lot of Korean visitors and Korean staff members. One of them was the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Kobe. That Consulate General just opened in Kobe 1 or 2 years before 1970. And Jaroslav Bařinka befriended the consul, and actually he received an invitation to visit South Korea. So in the beginning of my talk, I said that he was one of the first civilians to visit South Korea, and that was the occasion. He wasn't allowed to travel to South Korea legally, so the Consul General arranged for a forged Danish passport so that he could fly from Haneda to Gimpo and spend, I think, a week or up to 10 days touring the country. So of course this was not official, and Bařinka was very scared what would happen, and he suffered a panic attack just as the plane was departing, was taxiing from Haneda Airport. He wanted to stand up, announce that he's there on a forged passport, he's not allowed to travel, but the official companion next to him grabbed his arm and hissed into his ear, "Sit! It's too late to abort the mission." And it worked out for the good. Bařinka's visit to South Korea was very successful. He really enjoyed it. It was also very important for his intellectual development. The only downside was that when he was back in Czechoslovakia, again through Japan, he couldn't tell anybody about this. This was a completely secret mission. He had to hide all the photographs under a carpet. He couldn't tell even his colleagues or his major advisor about this. And I've never seen photographs from this visit. Even though we've had long conversations with Jaroslav Bařinka, he was reluctant to share some photographs, and I wonder whether the Korean scholars in Prague today, now that Bařinka has passed away, will get access to some of these resources. Okay. Another significant point in time, again, this I was talking about the year 1970 when Bařinka was in Japan. He was lucky to have avoided the purges that were going on in Prague post the Prague Spring events. So in 1968, what happened in Czechoslovakia is that there was liberalization, political opening up, and suddenly in August 1968, the Soviet army and other Warsaw Pact armies invaded Czechoslovakia, started shooting around. And in the months after that, there was a period of so-called normalization where ordinary citizens were asked to sign a form that they agreed with the invasion of Warsaw Pact armies. If you didn't sign this form, you would be fired from your job or severely demoted. Jaroslav Bařinka didn't have that dilemma what to report because he was abroad. And once he returned to Prague in 1971, he was lucky to have skipped that period of normalization. And he actually benefited from it because some academics were purged before that. So now some opportunities for him opened up. So he was able to get his research job at the Oriental Institute in Prague. And in 1972, he was sent to Pyongyang as an interpreter, or in the official position as a second secretary of the Trade Department. But I guess this success was short-lived. He kept getting negative or low ratings from his superiors, I think on political grounds, and so he couldn't. So he didn't stay in Pyongyang for the usual 4-year period. He was sent back to Czechoslovakia, and he was demoted in the sense that he couldn't continue with the ministry in the foreign sector service job, and even at the academic Oriental Institute, he couldn't focus on his countries of interest, Korea or Japan, and he for several years he had to work on other Soviet bloc countries that he wasn't interested in. Okay, I don't have to. In the 1980s, 1990s, he didn't have an official position with the ministry, but he kept providing language support, so interpretation support for Korean delegations in Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovak delegations to Korea. On this slide, I just relate some of the controversies or frictions that arose during the meetings. Let me quickly mention them. So, so one of the dilemmas was Kim Il-sung wanted to appease or please his hosts in Europe and wanted to strike some economic deal, but that would have to be favorable to the Czechs. On the other hand, when he was returning to North Korea, he wanted to present himself as a conqueror of Europe. So he had to, in this kind of double speak, he had to present the achievements in different ways. And Jaroslav Bařinka witnessed this himself. occasionally he was baffled that Kim Il-sung presented something to Czech media and to the Czech president, and then he turned around and presented the opposite story to the North Korean media. Jaroslav Bařinka was kind of stupefied. He looked at the interpreter from North Korea, at his partner from North Korea, and they shrugged shoulders, saying that, well, that's how things are. Don't worry about the contradictions in translation. Go with the flow. Kim Il-sung was also frustrated with his Czechoslovak partners because he wanted to get technical specifications of a Czech-made military truck, Tatra 613, I believe, but the Czechoslovak side was not able to share that. Under the Warsaw Pact, they could not share technical specifications with non-pact members, and this was a continuing friction between North Korea and the Warsaw Pact countries. North Korea could not get all the support that it wished because of the agreements under the Warsaw Pact. Last but not least, I can mention that industrial espionage was a common sight at North Korean delegations. So these groups of policymakers, even engineers, came to Czechoslovak factories, and as soon as they arrived and the formal guided tour started, some of the members of delegations spread out or hid themselves to try to copy or even take away parts from machinery in the factories. And so there was a major challenge in organization of tours for Korean delegations. So one of the goals of Bařinka was when the formal guided tour through a factory started, Bařinka had to chase after some members who got lost on factory grounds. Okay. In 1984, Kim Il-sung visited Czechoslovakia for the second time. From this trip, there we have many more photographs than from 1956. So here, a very, I think, famous photograph from Kim Il-sung's train, where Kim Il-sung has just crossed from, I think, East Germany to Czechoslovakia. He's joined by Vasil Biljak, who is the leader of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. Jaroslav Bařinka translating, another Czech interpreter here, and other important political figures. At the bottom, I show just a few photographs from the public television where Kim Il-sung's train arrived in Prague, and Kim Il-sung was met by the Czech president, Gustav Husák at that point. And the negotiations continued. In the 1990s, following the change in the regime, Jaroslav Bařinka kept joining delegations. So there was a delegation of Václav Havel and his wife Olga Havlová to South Korea, so here we have one photograph from that occasion, and some other appearances of Jaroslav Bařinka with the newly established South Korean ambassador, so the first South Korean ambassador to Prague in 1990, Sun Junyoung. And simultaneously, just a few years apart, the relationships between, at that point, Czech Republic and North Korea continued, and the Czech Republic welcomed the North Korean chairman of the Supreme People's Assembly, and Jaroslav Bařinka interpreted at that occasion. So basically, starting in 1990, Czechoslovakia and then Czech Republic continued having relations with both North Korea and South Korea. And I think with both sides there were frictions. It wasn't a love affair, but there were political and economic frictions with both regimes. Here I put a small quote from Bařinka. He recalled the first South Korean ambassador to Prague as a very arrogant person who thought very highly of himself. But as Czechoslovakia was coming to a split between Czech Republic and Slovakia, this man rigidly insisted that no, there would be no split. We have intelligence, that there's nothing to worry about. And when the country split into two, he returned to Seoul, kind of disgraced for making wrong predictions very uncompromisingly. Okay. I will skip that. Just briefly about the change of the regime in Czechoslovakia in 1989. So it's what we refer to as the Velvet Revolution, which we can say started on November 17th, the International Students' Day of 1989. Here I can make a small reference that actually it wasn't a one-time event. November 17th is a historically very important date because on November 17th, 1939, Gestapo, there were protests of Czech students against Nazi Germany around Czechoslovakia. And on November 17th, 1939, Gestapo did a massacre. They massacred a number of Czechoslovak students, and it became so this day became an important date for students to gather and protest against any injustices. And so exactly 50 years later, this led to a large uprising against the communist regime and led to the downfall of communism. So that's a remark on the side of the significance of the date. By the beginning of 1990, the regime has changed. All the old personalities were expunged. New government was established. But there was a vacuum of talent because most people, how can I say this, skilled people had been connected to the communist regime or had a record with the communist secret service, and they could not continue in the new administration. So Bařinka is one of the few who had a, we could say, clear conscience, was able to keep his academic position, and when the embassy opened, the Czechoslovak embassy opened in Seoul, he was appointed the first chargé d'affaires and continued all the way to 1994. So that's that was his unique position. Here I can just say that unfortunately, he was not entirely untarnished. We don't have the correct interpretation. What was Bařinka's role with the communist regime and with the secret service? But the fact is that I'll show. If we look online at the registry of collaborators with the secret service in communist Czechoslovakia, we do see his name, that we see him with his date of birth, as his in the position of an agent in the central, the headquarters of the secret service. We see him both as an agent and as a secret collaborator. But we also see at the bottom that his records have been destroyed. So there are no more records that we can consult to understand Bažinka's role with the Secret Service and with communists. And so the only word that we have is Bažinka's own interpretation. And Bažinka acknowledged that he is on the list of Secret Service collaborators, but he says that it was because he had been interrogated by the Secret Service, or he had to deal with the Secret Service to achieve certain things. So, for example, in the process of adopting a young Korean boy, surely he was visited by Secret Service and he had to provide justifications, explain his background for the state to allow him to keep the small foreign boy. And so we're not sure whether it was these meetings or it was just a procedure for him to get a foreign service job that he was visited by Secret Service. The fact remains that he is on the registry as an agent and secret collaborator. And on this ground, in 1994, the Minister of Foreign Affairs asked Bažinka to take early retirement. And we can see that was the end of Bažinka's formal engagement in diplomacy and also academia. And since then, he only did consulting gigs and or had small tasks as an interpreter or translator for specific events, but not in official capacities as a state employee. So the last minute, I would say, what is the legacy of Jaroslav Bažinka? Well, he was, I've talked about some of the first things that Bažinka was significant in. We can also add that he was the first ever research fellow with the Korean Studies program at the Oriental Institute in Prague. He held a long-term 2-year fellowship in Pyongyang. He prided himself on having toured all provinces, all provincial museums of history, in addition to all the provincial museums of Kim Il-sung around North Korea. And he presented his research at all European and as well as American congresses. These are the publications that Bažinka produced. And I will say this is the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for the time, and I'm sorry for running over the allotted time.
No, you're just fine. Thank you very much. That was, what an interesting personality. Very, very interesting. And you say that you're willing to present a paper to Transactions for consideration for publication. That'd be a very good idea. We'd welcome that.
I think I've collected a lot of material from talking to Mr. Bažinka, and I was only able to squeeze some of that into that one article. So actually I want to ask you, I'm sure we'll have follow-up discussion on whether that's appropriate and what would be interesting to the readers of the Transactions.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely no question. That would be very interesting. We've got some time for questions. We've got a few minutes. Anybody? Let's jump on in. Sam, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was really a riveting story. What an amazing, remarkable man. I was just curious, kind of why he initially, in the very beginning, when he was a young man, what drew him to Korea? Because you mentioned there were some publications and so forth that he had access to, but I was still wasn't quite sure what kind of led him to into Koreans, why he wanted to take that on when he was in university as a young man?
I think my interpretation is that he just had a very technical mind, and I think he wasn't interested in the humanities of it, but I think he started being interested in the geography. So
the minerals and
so exactly, and maybe even during the war he had some exposition. But in 1945, when things after the war suddenly opened up, there were magazines, there was the Research Institute in Prague. He started reading up, and in high school, he gave presentations on Korean geography. And I think, yeah, he was just really impressed. And when he found out that there was a North Korean born native instructor in Prague, I think this book by Han Soo, Korea Yesterday and Today, was very influential. It was a major piece. So that's what I think, that Bařinka wanted to continue this work and learn from this man himself.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Anybody else? Leona, go ahead. Unmute and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you for your lecturing. And then I'm a professor of the Gyeongnam University, the majoring in the Korean studies. So it is quite interesting to me. As a historian, I actually have lots of questions, but the lecture is quite short. So yeah, I just ask you just one or two question. I just wonder, in 1950s, around the 50s, he changed his mind. He was pro-communist into that, the converted to the communist, but, it is quite your explanation is quite short. So, actually it's a good turning point, important one, but yeah, I want to know what is the background. And then second question is, actually, there's a lots of the picture of the 1960s that of DPRK. Then I'm actually the board members of the National Archives. So I think any documents or the pictures, if you try to donate it that archives, then it's great to opportunity to other scholars and then the institution. So it is not just the question, it's just some asking the real. And then I want to know that the full relationship between Czechoslovakia and then North Korea or South Korea, but during this Cold War, it's quite a subtle, and then or important figures they related to some sort of the political that kind of the role. So it is really delicate when he just the talk about that the political effects or the real role. So that I want to know what was that the basic role at the basic relationship, the Czech and then South Korea, do you think? I know it is too broad, but through him, you just focus on his own life, right? So yeah, I want to know what is that basic relationship, the Czech and then especially the DPRK, right? I know it is so complicated, but yeah, the big one, I want to know that, especially the 50s and 60s. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
A couple of simple ideas, right?
That was a big question.
Sorry about that, but
Not at all.
Too sure. So
No, not at all.
I just narrowed it to the 50s and 60s.
Yeah,
and
there
then
you go. Yeah,
PRK, right?
you bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
maybe I should start with the presentation over to go over. No, so just quickly, how did Bařinka convert to anti-communism? I don't think he was ever on the ideological communist side, but I think he was maybe at first he was naive and maybe not caring, we could say. I don't think he, I don't know, I view it that he didn't follow politics, wasn't interested in politics until 1948. Mm-hmm. So he admitted himself that until 1948 he was leaning, you're right, that he was leaning toward social democracy, a little bit leftist, leftist regime. But he himself, he was puzzled by it himself. He said that he doesn't know why, since even in 1945, this Soviet soldier barged in their house and started shooting everybody. But all of a sudden in 1948, when he saw the soldiers shooting at students, and that was the shock moment for him. So at the time of the communist coup. And I think maybe that's the experience of many Czechs. I wasn't born then, but I think people were shocked. Until 1948, people were pro-communist. It was a good popular party. I think it was number 2. It wasn't the most popular party, but it carried a lot of votes, and it was a shock to everybody how much. I think so now the high level interpretations are that they received support, maybe even instruction from Moscow, that was the time to organize a coup and take power in Czechoslovakia. So there were assassinations in those years. So I would say that the party itself wasn't as evil, but maybe from these influences, even from Moscow, the regime suddenly became very extremist, and it became evil in 1948. So that's my limited answer to that question. On the photos that I have, they're not my photos. So I don't have physical photos. I have only digital photos from Jaroslav Bařinka's own archive. I think the photographs are being processed by maybe Charles University or the Korean scholars in Czechoslovakia. And I hope that some of it will become, or all of it will become publicly visible soon. I will be happy to share in digital form what I have. So I don't have any archive of my own. I do have some photographs from Czech National Archive, where there are some folders which have not been officially released because they're still being processed. But I'll be happy to share in digital form what I have. Okay, and the last question on the Czechoslovak-Korean relations. I think, yeah, I'm not a historian, this is too complicated for me, but I think the key word here is strategic, that the relationships were very strategic, and maybe even short-termish. If a North Korean regime expected to get some support during the Korean War or in the year after the war, that shaped the negotiations and the communication between the two sides. But it's also multi-layer. There was that Sino-Soviet split. There was the coup in North Korea. Even a relationship between Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia would affect what happened in relation to North Korea. So it wasn't a bilateral relationship. So that complicates things. Some of the descriptions that I provided during my presentation, that's my own interpretation. Bařinka told me about his own lifetime stories, And I don't think he made too many references to these high-level political trends. And so you had to kind of read between the lines to see how his fate was determined by the political developments. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Our next lecture will be on October 26th, 2 weeks from tonight, at 7:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time. Our speaker will be Dr. Fyodor Cherchitsky. He was born in Moscow in 1988, received a PhD from Seoul National University in 2017, and he currently works as a leading researcher at Kookmin University here in Seoul. Fyodor is a historian and mainly is focused on North Korea during the Kim Il-sung era. His English language book about the social history of the North Korean army and his Korean biography, his biography of Kim Il-sung in Korean, are both scheduled to appear next year. So one book in English, one in Korean. His lecture will deal with a largely unstudied topic, the very first few weeks of North Korean history, immediately after Tokyo surrendered in 1945 until October, about 8 weeks later, when this young captain of the Soviet army named Kim Il-sung was chosen to lead the newborn state. And yeah, Matt is showing the book on the topic, only in Korean, but a very interesting read. I think that was Fyodor's doctoral dissertation, if I'm not mistaken, but North Korea before Kim Il-sung. So there's about an 8-week period there when, and that his book and his lecture will cover that, that topic. So should be very interesting discussion that night. Please check our website and our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of past lectures and hopefully other helpful content. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you all.
Thank you again. Appreciate it,
Thank you.
Vladimir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye.